In this story, I'm going to tell you how I quietly uncovered my husband siphoning our joint savings to fund his sister, using our everyday routines against me. But this isn't a dramatic showdown or a police sting. I built a patient legal trap, meticulous evidence, a timed family reveal, and one tiny calendar invite that unraveled his lies, and the real revenge was reclaiming my home, my future, and everyone's truth. My name is Evelyn, and for 10 years my life revolved around Jonah, my husband, and the little rituals we built in our Portland bungalow. We met at a farmer's market on a rainy June morning and spent a whole afternoon arguing about the best sourdough and laughing at each other's bad coffee orders. That became our story milestone we tell relatives as if it were a fairy tale. We kept that story on a loop at family dinners and holiday toasts because it sounded like proof that something real had happened between us, a beginning with charm and the kind of ordinary delight you can still point to when everything else grows complicated. It framed our shared life like a photograph, bright, grainy, and easy to hold up when you needed to remember why you'd chosen someone. Our daily routine was simple and steady. He left the kettle on the stove low for my early tea. I packed his lunch and tucked a little note inside it. We walked our dog Hazel together at 6 p.m. without fail, and every Sunday we cooked a shared recipe and called my mother to swap details about gardening and bills. Those rituals weren't trivial. Over the years, they became the quiet architecture of trust. Jonah's small habits, folding his laundry the same way, keeping the recycling calendar pinned to the fridge, bringing home flowers in winter because the house looked sad, felt like constant deposits in a relational bank account. We planned futures like cemented promises, a backyard studio for my design work, a quiet road trip to the coast when Jonah turned 35, and a promise that we would pay off the mortgage in 5 years so we could finally adopt a second dog. We spoke of these plans like blueprints, with Jonah sketching numbers on napkins and me mapping color swatches for the studio walls. Those were the trust anchors I leaned on, the shared milestone of how we met and decided we were a team, the daily rituals that proved we could rely on each other to notice and care for small things, and the future plans that made me believe our lives were jointly steered. Jonah handled our finances because I travel sometimes and he was meticulous with spreadsheets. He managed the mortgage account, the joint savings, and paid recurring bills while I kept receipts for work reimbursement. I admired how calm he was under pressure, how he could soothe my mother when visits frayed, and how he would stay up late researching warranties when a big purchase threatened our budget. For a long time, nothing felt impossible to share or to ask him to fix. He enjoyed the quiet prestige of being the one who could make complicated things disappear: tax forms, insurance questions, anxious relatives, and I liked that he took pride in being useful. The first small snag felt like a fluke, a misfiled utility bill that arrived late, which we fixed together. It seemed like the sort of thing that happens when you have a busy month. But a misfiled bill is a small crack and cracks propagate. Then the late notices stacked up and a text from our mortgage servicer landed in my phone while I was at a meeting. Jonah said it was an error, that he had transferred money, that the glitch would be fixed. I trusted him and I believed him. His explanations initially had the same texture as everything else with him, plausible, practiced, and calm, but the ways he explained things changed. A laugh about his forgetfulness became a shield whenever I pushed. His calm shifted into a private stiffness when I asked about transfers, and he began insisting that I not worry, that he had everything under control. Whenever I suggested checking a statement together, he reminded me, gently but firmly, that he handled the accounts because my travel schedule made it harder for me to track them. I started finding small signs that something was off. A recurring notification showing a transfer I did not remember authorizing, a note with two different totals written in Jonah's handwriting, and a voicemail from my sister asking if everything was okay at home. Each of those things felt minor alone, but together they made my stomach tighten, like a familiar song hitting a wrong chord. I could not imagine confronting him without proof, and I could not walk away because our mortgage, our plan to adopt, and the people who trusted us, my mother, my in-laws, were all woven into his decisions. I told myself that demanding control over the accounts would be petty, that it would signal distrust. The routines that had once been intimacy started to look like vulnerabilities he could exploit. The way he brewed my tea without me asking, the way he scheduled our budget meetings on quiet Tuesday nights, the trust I had in his handwriting on financial notes. It felt impossible to disentangle affection from oversight. At first, the irregularities read like the innocent mistakes of someone juggling too much. Double-scheduled withdrawals, mislabeled vendor names that could be typos, a transfer dated on the afternoon he said he was doing freelance consulting. I asked Jonah for the shared online statements under the pretense of reconciling our budgeting app, and he said sure and then left the laptop open on our kitchen island while he took Hazel out. It was the first time our private domestic choreography allowed me to see a layer of his life I had not been privy to. I skimmed the statements and found transfers out of our joint savings that had no clear purpose, payments to a new vendor name I did not recognize, and a recurring withdrawal timed around when he did freelance consulting under his old company name. The vendor names were bland, initials and service-sounding handles that might have belonged to contractors or to abstract corporate entities. They felt like coded messages that didn't belong in our account. I brought it up gently at dinner, and he smiled like he always did when deflecting stress, told me it was for a business expense and that he would show me receipts later. He had a talent for making surprise questions feel like small potholes on a well-paved road. The receipts did not appear. I texted him during the week asking for clarification, and he answered slowly, then with irritation, saying he was under deadline and could not be interrupted. At first, I thought he was protecting a client or a surprise home project. My attempts to check the account history legally by contacting the bank were stonewalled by Jonah saying he would handle it, and because I trusted him, I let him. When I started overhearing his phone calls in the evenings, brief, hushed conversations where he used a different name, I felt foolish for imagining the worst. I told myself 1,000 rationalizations, maybe a side gig, maybe a fluke. But rationalization is a dangerous slow drip. It lets anxiety evaporate into explanations that preserve order. My inner voice cataloged possibilities like a librarian cataloging books: plausible, unproven, keep for now. Then family pressure escalated our small problem into a public strain. At a Sunday dinner with my mother and Jonah's sister Mara, Jonah announced that he had promised to help Mara with a down payment on her place because she was trying to move closer to her children. Mara's gratitude was performative and loud. She cradled a mug like it was the trophy of a favor. My mother squeezed my hand and later whispered congratulations. I felt squeezed between relief for Mara and an odd prickly jealousy. The numbers Jonah projected were vague in the way of practiced storytellers, enough to earn praise without giving away detail. When I asked Jonah privately how he'd swing that and still keep our 5-year plan, he grew defensive and said he was helping family and that I was making it sound like a crime to care for your relatives. I should have pushed then, but instead I let it go. The bills kept coming. A notice about our credit rating arrived in the mail, an alarming header, an ambiguous paragraph, and when I showed Jonah, he promised he would sort it. Then my mother confided that my father had gotten cold calls about unpaid taxes in his name because something in his documents suggested he had been head of a company that no one remembered. It began to look like a pattern where Jonah's choices bled into family reputations. I tried to involve Mara gently, telling her I wanted to understand the timeline of her loan, and she brushed me off, insisting Jonah had only done her a favor. My friends suggested I demand transparency, but every time I pushed, Jonah replied with love language, notes, small gifts, organizing a weekend to the coast, and protests that I was making him out to be a villain. He knew how to deploy charm as a closure device: a bouquet at twilight, a handwritten apology on fragrant stationery. The relationship routines I trusted now felt weaponized against me. Shared accounts and habits that let him move money without immediate flags, phone calls he placed in another room so I could not overhear, and our family gatherings where he paraded generosity in ways that made me the one who doubted him. I felt trapped because his betrayal, if that is what it was, used the very intimacy I had cultivated. I began documenting things quietly. I saved text messages where he promised receipts, took pictures of confusing alerts, and kept a journal of dates when transfers occurred. I clipped emails and annotated bank statements in my notebook with red, patient pen strokes. Each time I tried to bring this up in a family-heavy context, Jonah deflected and our relatives lined up behind his version because he was charming and he had always been the fixer. The more I documented, the more he lectured me about trust, saying I was eroding the warmth he cultivated with our families. When I presented a summarized list of questionable transfers at dinner, he laughed and said I was creating drama and suggested I was jealous of his relationship with Mara. My mother's face flickered, torn between instinct to protect me and the decades of stories where Jonah had been helpful to everyone. The house felt smaller and colder as certainty slipped. Small rituals, coffee cups left where he preferred them, my hand finding his at the kitchen table, lost the soft meaning they once held. My lowest point arrived on a weekday morning when I opened an email from the mortgage servicer saying they had paused our auto pay until we resolved an irregularity. The notice suggested a drop in our joint savings that matched transfers I had logged. The formal language of the email, the scanned logo, the procedural tone, those things felt like verdicts. Jonah stepped into the doorway, put his hand on my shoulder, and told me not to worry. But when I told my mother that evening, she looked at Jonah, then at me, and the room split open, my family's trust bending toward him. I felt isolated, blamed for creating tension, and suddenly every small kindness he had given over the years felt like a ledger entry being used to quiet my alarm. I hit rock bottom and then climbed into a plan that was patient, lawful, and aimed to change the family dynamic entirely. I chose quiet documentation and a timed reveal to the right people because I had to protect our home, my future plans, and the family's sense of truth. There was a part of me that still expected a tidy explanation, a stack of receipts that showed a rational sequence. When that expectation failed, I realized the project was not getting Jonah to confess. It was about reconstituting a damaged structure so it could hold the rest of our lives. I started by consolidating every bit of evidence into a single, organized file. Screenshots of text messages where Jonah promised receipts, copies of bank alerts showing transfers labeled in ways that did not match our joint budget categories, a printed email about the mortgage auto pay pause, and my journal entries with dates that matched those transactions. I photocopied things and put sticky tabs on pages, because there is a comfort in tangibility when trust has become abstract. I also collected a small set of witness accounts. Mara's offhand comment to a neighbor about a friendly loan, a neighbor who remembered seeing Jonah carry boxes to a rental storage unit at odd hours, and Hazel's vet record that showed Jonah had taken cash out for a clinic fee he never explained. Each whisper turned into a piece of a mosaic. I met with a family mediator friend of a cousin and asked for advice on how to present facts without drama. The mediator reminded me that the goal was to change the relationship system, not humiliate Jonah. That sentence felt like oxygen. I prepared a calm presentation that showed timelines, amounts, and how the transfers affected our mortgage and future plans. I printed charts and labeled dates like the patient surgeon of my own life. I rehearsed not to win an argument, but to prevent him from reasserting the unilateral control he'd exerted. I picked a neutral Saturday after our weekly walk with Hazel and asked Jonah to join me for coffee in our living room with my mother and Mara present. He hesitated but agreed, confident that his performance of openness would shield him. He always trusted his ability to talk himself through tensions. It had worked before. When we sat down, I spoke first, using the routines he and I had shared as anchors. I recited our Sunday cooking plan, the kettle on the stove, the notes in lunches, and the 5-year mortgage promise, because I wanted everyone to remember the trust that had been broken. I wanted them to feel the weight of what small kindnesses mean when they are used as cover. Then I laid out the evidence calmly, a series of transfers, dates that matched events Jonah had described differently, and text messages where he had promised receipts he never produced. I pointed to the calendar invite he'd sent for a budget review and the confirmation number hidden in the invite that matched an external account I had discovered. The details were small and precise, the kind of thing a spreadsheet can reveal when it quietly refuses to be misread. Jonah's face changed from amusement to annoyance to anger. He began to craft an explanation about helping family and investing in a business. He spoke with the practiced cadence of someone who has spun stories before. Mara interjected with gratitude about the help and shrugged off the numbers as small. My mother asked for clarification, and I handed her the most damning piece. The innocuous calendar invite Jonah had sent me months earlier for a budget review that contained a linked confirmation number matching an external account I had found. That calendar invite was our seed. Jonah had used our routine to schedule what he called a budgeting check-in, but had embedded details that exposed the timeline of his withdrawals. He contradicted the calendar detail at first, saying he had a sloppy memory, and then his timeline crumbled under the weight of the receipts and our witnesses. He tried one final lie, claiming he had my permission to move money and help Mara, but Mara's own texts contradicted him. She had thanked him for fixing things quickly after he had told her to say certain words when family asked. The room went quiet as my mother's eyes filled. Jonah sputtered, then quieted. The mediator suggested we pause and consider structural boundary enforcement, immediate separation of accounts, and a temporary moratorium on family loans until we all met with a financial counselor. I asked for those changes and Jonah resisted, but seeing the paper trail and my mother's disappointment made it harder for him to bulldoze consensus. He packed a bag that night and left to stay with a friend, insisting it was because I had humiliated him. The change was painful but necessary. It rebalanced who had access to our finances and, most importantly, brought family accountability into the room. After the reveal, consequences unfolded in ways that reshaped our family and my life. We closed our joint savings account within a week and set up separate accounts with a small joint emergency fund that required both our signatures. The financial counselor formalized boundaries I had been too afraid to ask for. My mother, who had been hurt by the betrayal but also humiliated by having been misled, apologized for doubting me privately and helped me explain the new arrangements to extended family. Mara distanced herself, admitting that she had benefited and that Jonah had framed it as mutual help. Jonah sought mediation and legal advice. He argued that he had been trying to preserve family stability and that secrecy had been reckless but not malicious. The mediator recommended a slow rebuild rather than an immediate reconciliation. We agreed not to cohabitate for a while so I could secure my housing stability and my credit standing without daily pressure. My place in the family shifted. Relatives who had once praised Jonah for his generosity now asked questions. People who assumed I was exaggerating offered quiet support once they saw the evidence. I felt vindicated but also lonely in ways I had not expected. The theft of trust left small scars that kindness could not immediately heal. I regained control over our future plan by renegotiating the budget for the backyard studio solely in my name and applying for grant opportunities tied to artists in Portland so I would not be financially dependent on Jonah's management. That boundary felt like a small victory and a promise to myself. The poetic consequence was not punishment but exposure and restructuring. Jonah lost the unilateral access he had abused, the family learned that charity needs clear rules, and I reclaimed dignity in front of the people who mattered. The final twist came weeks later when Jonah attempted a last gaslight at a family meeting. insisting he had only moved money to protect Mara from a predatory landlord and that I had misunderstood every message. He expected his performance to tilt the room, but my mother quietly produced a photograph she had taken months earlier during a cookout. Jonah had the keys to a storage unit in his hand with a sticky note attached that read, in Jonah's handwriting, "Mara stash, do not tell E." The note was an innocent-seeming tradition turned into clear evidence. Jonah's timeline collapsed, and with it the excuse that intimacy justified his secrecy. He agreed to counseling and to a legal accounting of transfers, and I insisted on a written family agreement about loans. It was not a cinematic revenge. It was the slow, deliberate work of truth-telling that changed the home I had built. Today our new normal is quieter. Jonah and I are negotiating a separation of households while we each rebuild our financial and emotional footing. My mother visits more often to help with Hazel, and Mara has fewer free passes with relatives. I kept the studio plan and enrolled in a local design incubator, which means my future is less contingent on someone else's bookkeeping. Sometimes, when the house is empty in the late afternoon, I sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea Jonah used to warm for me and read through the notebook where I tracked dates and receipts. The handwriting feels like evidence and eulogy at once. I do not relish the way things ended, but the reordering of lines has been necessary. Trust can be lost, but boundaries can be rebuilt. And when betrayal comes from the person who knows the most intimate parts of your life, the only real revenge is to protect your home, your plans, and your dignity so you can grow again.